Oh, hello. We're live. Okay. Hello. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Testers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is very, very much not therapy for so many reasons. I try to be very clear about that. So clear about it that it's literally what we call it. I don't want there to be any confusion. This is just an open conversation uh, where I'm here for an hour a week, and anybody who wants to be here and chat with me about anything, we can do it. So, for those of you who are here, thank you for being here. Uh, I appreciate it even more. Those of you who are not only here watching, but also in the chat and putting things out there, so I don't feel like I'm totally alone. No, really, it's more fun for me, for sure. But if I don't have any specific input that I can observe about the people that I'm talking to, I just have to guess what you guys might be interested in here. Guess how you might be interpreting the things that I'm saying. So it's more helpful for me to get specific feedback from you guys. In fact, just as a bit of an aside, I suppose, I've been in conversation with different people recently, especially, but for a while now, about what it would mean, what it means to be neurodiversity affirming in whatever area we're discussing. Mostly, we're talking about therapy and education and parenting and things like that. And my number one rule every time, no matter what field we're talking about, is that a person's self-report is the most important, most valid evidence, information, data about anything having to do with that person. Which is just a way for me to say right now that I can make guesses, and I'll make guesses, and hopefully it's helpful and interesting and whatever. But nothing is more helpful, more important, more valid than you guys saying the truth about what it is that you're thinking or wanting or feeling or whatever. So, appreciate you. If you do chat, just know that if you're watching this on Facebook, it'll pop up under your Facebook name. If you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be your Google account. And if you're watching on Twitch, it'll be your Twitch account. So keep that in mind. This will also be saved as a video on demand on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch after the fact. And I'm pretty sure that saves comments as well. So know that it's public. This is an open conversation that can be Q&A type things, but really it's just when you converse with people, when you are communicating and paying attention to other people, the things that they do shape you. What response you give is shaped by the things that the other people are doing. So we're impacting each other. I always pick a topic to start talking about so that it's not just quiet until somebody here puts something out. And I have one today. But if you guys who are here and in the chat want to talk about something else, we'll talk about whatever. We don't have to stay within that topic. That's just to get us going. What else do I need to say? I run a small private group practice called Effective Artistry. We do therapy, and separately, we also do executive functioning coaching. We have coaches and we have therapists, not people that are both, which are two different modalities of helping people. And we particularly focus on helping people who identify as neurodivergent. But more importantly than specifically who we work with, is that we approach this work through a neurodiversity affirming lens, through the neurodiversity paradigm. Oh, I thought someone was knocking on my door, but I think that's downstairs. And executive functioning, that we bring an awareness of executive functioning into the work that we're doing with people. In executive functioning coaching, obviously the focus there specifically is to help people improve executive functioning skills while dealing with specific executive functioning issues, right? I feel like I'm talking quietly and deeply today. I don't know. I'm a little frazzled today, honestly. Start of the school year and COVID going around my child's school and all kinds of fun stuff. I think that's mostly the important stuff. I apologize if I forgot to mention anything, but let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about, at least to start, parenting, a lot about parenting, primarily because we're getting ready to launch, I did think I've mentioned this before, but a Neurodiversity-Affirming Parenting Group. Thank you. Zoe, who just wrote in the chat, is our Director of Operations. She's been on the stream, I think, once. So she had some stuff for me to talk about or brainstorm or work through, and I told her to just prompt me on here, and I can do it here. maybe provide assignments for listeners identifying their own executive functioning and offloading, etc. Yeah, okay, we can do that. So we're starting this group, which is more of a like series of webinars than a therapeutic group or anything like that. It's 6 weeks, and we touch on a different topic area in each of those weeks. And I'll give a presentation for 15, 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll spend the remainder of the 90 minutes that we have together going around and talking about specific things from the lives of each of the attendees and working on, as a group, collectively, ideas to help in those situations. And then people taking away worksheets and, information, all that kind of fun stuff. I think we're going to be starting that. So maybe you can say, I don't remember, first week of October, I think. So if people are interested, let us know. We actually, I think, have more people interested than we have room for one group already, but we can always open another. Neurodiversity-Affirming Parenting. All right, let me say this off the top real quick, that neurodiversity, I know I've said this on the stream before, but I think it is important to say. Second week of October, thanks, Zoe. I know I said this before, but I think it's important to say because it gets lost. Because the simpler way of talking about neurodiversity is the more common way of talking about it, because that's brain is a cognitive miser, right? The simpler version of anything is the more widespread version of that thing, which is the way that most people are talking about neurodiversity these days is based on the premise that some people are neurodivergent and some people are not. And different people will debate or make claims about what kind of person counts as being neurodivergent and what kind of person does not. Generally, it's pretty agreed upon that autism, ADHD, dyslexia, all the disses they call it, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. I don't know of anybody that's really claiming that wouldn't qualify as neurodivergent. But from there, it gets different. Some people will say that mental illness is a separate thing, that it's not neurodivergence. Some people will say that it is. That view is helpful and it's useful because it's simple and it's easy to carry around and it's better than nothing. But it is not the full breadth of neurodiversity, which is an approach. It's a way of looking at the world. It's not a way of categorizing people. Neurodiversity just means that humans, we have different brains, and that is as intended. That is by design. We're supposed to have different brains. And of course, I don't think anybody would have a problem with that, in theory. In practice, our culture for a long time has been primarily based around, in the ways that we talk about neurodiversity anyway. Prior to the concept of neurodiversity, it was primarily talked around in what we call the deficit model, which is we can draw a circle around what we would call normal functioning, and we could also call it healthy functioning or common or good or appropriate. All of those things are considered to be the same thing. So any way of being that exists outside of that circle is considered to be a deficit. It is a deficient way to be. And that the goal then is to take anybody who is outside of that circle in any way and get them inside the circle through whatever method you're using to try to do that. That is still the predominant way of looking at all of this stuff in our culture. Neurodiversity is a specific philosophical and political approach that's a response to that, which is to say, we can talk about what is normal in terms of what is most common. We can't talk about what is normal and just assume that means what is best or what is good or what is right or what is healthy. And therefore, we can't assume that things that are not normal are therefore unhealthy or bad or deficient in any way. We're different. I'm 6'5". You're probably not 6'5" because not many people are. Any way of being is situationally advantageous or disadvantageous. Being 6'5" is great when I want to reach something from a high shelf or when I want to play basketball, although I'm actually terrible at basketball. I'd probably be a lot worse if I was shorter than I am. And it sucks when I'm trying to fly across the country in coach or when I want to buy clothes at the store and I can't find anything that fits me. It depends on what you're trying to do and the context in which you're trying to do it. Humans, we're a population, we're a group, we're a community. The largest version of that would be the whole species. And then, of course, there's infinite ways to subdivide that down. And what we do well, what our brains and bodies are designed for, is to communicate and collaborate with each other, to specialize, that I handle this while you handle that. It allows us to divide things up. It allows us as individuals to specialize and become very efficient and knowledgeable at certain limited tasks, because we don't have to do all these other things because other people are doing it. You probably don't grow your own food or make your own clothes, which frees up the time that and energy and other resources that you would have been spending on that to focus on whatever it is that you are focused on, right? So I know a lot about this and all this stuff, and I spend hours and hours and hours every day working on this, talking to people, thinking about this, reading and learning, and I'm not spending that time and energy thinking about other things that I am glad other people are handling, right? So I have to stipulate that stuff at first, because if we're going to talk about being neurodiversity affirming, a lot of people are going to view that to mean, okay, here's how to do something in a way that works for what they would call neurotypical people, normal people. But if someone isn't neurotypical, they're neurodivergent, here's how you can do things to help support them, which is great. Like I said, it's better than not doing that. But even better than that is to say, here's how you can do things in a way that is focused on the specific individuals in front of you with whom you are doing those things, so that it doesn't matter whether you qualify them as neurotypical or neurodivergent or any other thing, because it doesn't presuppose any way of being. It takes into account the way that they are. It is adjusted and adapted for you, whoever you are, whether you qualify as having a particular diagnosis or qualify as being neurodivergent according to yours or anybody else's opinion. Those are good and important things to know because they're helpful. They carry a lot of information. But in education, they call this universal design, that we want to design things so that rather than having to, actually, I saw a great comic I wish I could find it. I should try to look at it. And obviously I didn't create it, but I think it illustrates it well. I think a lot of people have seen the like little visual, the comic of three people, a tall, medium height, and short person standing behind a fence trying to watch a baseball game. And there are three boxes, and it's about equity versus fairness versus justice and all those kinds of things, right? So in the first image, it's the tall person has all three boxes, but they didn't need any to see. And we talk about that as inequity. And then it's in the second one, everybody gets one box, but then the tallest person can see but didn't need a box to see, and the middle height person, I don't know what word you use, average height person, can see when they couldn't have seen before because they needed a box, and the short person still can't see because they need two to get over the fence. So that's not that. I think that's generally what people would label that as equality, but not equity, but people use different words differently. And then the third image is everybody can see and everybody's at the same height because the tall person has no boxes, middle has one, and the short person has two. I saw somebody modify that recently, I don't know how old it is, where the fourth one is justice, and it just takes away the fence. That's what we're talking about. As opposed to saying, this is how things need to be done. This is the right way to do things. And if you are incapable of doing those things because we have diagnosed you with blah, 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 that's deficit model. But if you are incapable of doing those things because of some condition or whatever, then we will provide you with specific supports designed for people who share that condition or that way of being, or who also meet the criteria for that diagnosis, to be able to accomplish what we're asking you to accomplish in the first place. Whereas what we really want to go for, universal design, is to make it so that we don't need to do accommodations because we have removed any artificial barriers to entry, that we are focused in on specifically the intrinsic meaning and value of the things that are happening, not stipulating that something must be done. And if you are bad at that thing, okay, fine, we'll help you out with some kind of accommodation to be better at that thing, but it still must be done. Does that make sense? So neurodiversity affirming anything to me means a way of doing that thing that takes into account the fact that every single person is unique and no rule is going to work well for everybody. And it doesn't really matter how much you divide people up into smaller and smaller groups. If we say, okay, well, this rule for everybody, well, that doesn't help autistic people. So this rule for autistic people, well, that's still not going to help all the people that fit into that category. So we just want to design something that is individualized from the jump, instead of assuming it must be done this way unless it can be proven or justified that we should do it in some other way. This is really, really important to me, and very common and very problematic, especially for neurodivergent people. People humans, the way that we operate is we just do things the way, to the best of our ability, the way that we observe other humans doing those things. That's the first and fastest and easiest way to learn, is to just watch and mimic. It's not until something that we're mimicking causes a problem then that we say, wait, am I doing it wrong? Or is that way of doing it, did it rely on something that was true about that other person I saw doing it, but isn't true about me? And usually we start with that first one. I must be doing it wrong. I must have missed something. And then, no, I'm going down a whole path I don't need to go down. The problem with that way of doing it is that it's like saying that I need help. What do you mean need? How bad does it have to be? As opposed to being able to just say, at the very first sign of discomfort, the very first sign of something not being a good fit or something not working, to say that right away, to explore that right away. It's, okay, that didn't work, but I'll keep trying. That didn't work, but I'll keep trying, until it reaches a certain threshold of discomfort, pain, struggle, suffering, whatever. And then you can say, okay, now I'm allowed to ask for something to be different. And then people tend to look for this new secret set of rules. Okay, the regular rules didn't work for me. I need the special rules for people like me. Rules don't work for everybody. And if we give a second set of rules, well, sure, autistic people can't blah, 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 but autistic people do really well at blah, blah, blah. Well, then there's going to be at least one autistic person, but probably many, for whom that is not true. And now they're going to have to go through that experience all over again of, okay, well, the normal stuff didn't work for me and I felt bad about it, but then I realized it's not my fault. It's just that I'm different than other people and I'm autistic. Now the autistic stuff doesn't work for me either. Now how does that person feel? That, oh man, I'm so different or weird or unusual or have such large deficits that I can't even be helped by the things that are meant to help people like me. What's wrong with me? So we're removing the fence instead of figuring out how many boxes everybody needs. That's what we mean when we say neurodiversity affirming. And that's why, like I said at the beginning of this, to me, the most important rule of any neurodiversity affirming approach is that a person's report of their own lived experience supersedes any other evidence, any other data, any other analysis or thought or opinion about that person's experience. Nobody gets to override a person's report of their own experience. So in terms of parenting, an example of that would be, well, my child really likes X, really seems to enjoy X, and I'm not aware of it being problematic, causing any issues, hurting them, harming them. You know, maybe I want to be careful about not having them engage with X too much because there's other things that are also valuable and worthy of spending time and energy and other resources on. But other than the tendency of any human to want to lean in too far to the things they enjoy the most, I don't see an issue with it. They're not having a problem. They enjoy it. But everybody knows that it's unhealthy, that X is bad for kids. That's an example of, if you then try to limit or restrict their access to X, you know, their ability to engage with whatever X is, that's an example where you are superseding their report and your observation and your experience, their experience, with expert analysis, research, evidence, whatever. And all that stuff is good and valid. I'm not trying to take away any of that. But it is not meant to be applied at the individual level. That's not what large-scale studies are for. Obviously, they're done at large scale for that reason. In fact, when you get a result in one of those studies that significantly differs from others, you call it an outlier and you throw it out of the data more often than not. You say, oh, that was just some weird, who knows, we can't explain it, but it's only one, so it's not a valid piece of information. It's just neglected from then whatever analysis is done of the data that you collected. Studies, evidence, all this stuff is massively important. I'm all for it, not trying to take away from it. It is not meant then to guide your decision-making on a personal level beyond what it is for, which is to say, well, it seems as though most people who are dealing with this are benefited by this, or most people who are doing this thing face this negative consequence later on. It does not mean that you as an individual will. And parents in particular are stuck here because, of course, you want your parenting to be guided by best practices. You know that there are things that you don't know, that other people, like we talked about before, who are more specialized and have more of an opportunity to know more, study, talk, learn, think about that, about parenting, about childhood development, that you want to rely on their expertise. And that's a great thing. Just remember that expertise is large scale, not specific to an individual. So the thing that I find to be most helpful and what I try to focus on then as an expert is either working with somebody one-on-one or, in a small, where we can be individualized to the person, or small, couple or family or small group or whatever. Or if we're going to do something on a large scale, like a presentation or a webinar or just putting thoughts out there or whatever, then we have to focus on frameworks and approaches, not specific recommendations. Otherwise, we create the implication, no, not create, otherwise we imply that the specific recommendations we're giving should work. And if they don't, you are doing something wrong. And we're right back at square one. Again, especially parents. I have 3 young children myself, in case anybody doesn't know. What is more important than their future well-being, right? Their current well-being, and that's it. So everything else, I'd be willing to make changes and sacrifices. And if I believe that it will be better for them in the long run to do this thing, then I'll do that thing. I'll pay a high cost. And then as parents, that means that we're often chasing around the latest trends or fads or whatever, recommendations from different experts, because we're trying to do what's best. And we know that there are things that we don't know. The biggest problem with most of that approach to parenting is that it disenfranchises the child. The best source of information about your child is your child. And we don't tend to approach it that way because in this culture, it is mostly thought of as that kids are basically incomplete versions of adults, that they are less than or incomplete, that they are subordinate, some deficient version of grown-ups, which is not the case at all. Children are people just like every person is a person, and they are complete people. Will they grow and change? Sure. And so will you, and so will I. So for example, one thing I've seen here a lot that causes problems, and I absolutely hate, is, the prefrontal cortex doesn't finish developing until roughly age 25. Different studies give different exact numbers, but mostly it's talked about as being at age 25. Sometimes people will then say, except for this subgroup of people, it's even later or earlier or whatever, right? To somehow take that and then say, well, therefore, until you are 25, you should not be able to make any decisions for yourself because your prefrontal cortex hasn't finished developing. It's an understandable logic, but it's full of holes, because finished is a real reductive term here. We just mean it does not have all the pieces and it is not the size that it will eventually be, but it doesn't ever stop. Your brain does not stop changing. We have a term for it, brain plasticity, although brain plasticity is usually used to refer to the fact that even if we damage a part of somebody's brain, not we damage, but even if a part of someone's brain is damaged, that the brain is able then to work around that damage, and other parts of the brain which were previously responsible for different things start to take on the load of whatever that portion of the brain. Our brains are adaptable. Nobody's ever done. So no, we can't say, at age 25, from then on, everything that you say is perfectly reasoned and well thought through and will only benefit you, but anything before age 25 is not. And of course, nobody would take it to that extent. But I have seen on many occasions people say, your brain isn't fully developed yet, so I'm basically dismissing what you're saying, which is not neurodiversity affirming approach, to tell people that you're dismissing what they're saying about their own experience. Make sure that, I want to be clear, about their own experience. Not everybody's word is the final word on anything they ever say, just on their experience. Anyway, I hope that's enough to say for now about what this approach is, what we're talking about doing, which is mostly just helping parents to understand that while it's useful to have all that other information and consider that other information, that at the end of the day, the best thing for any parent and child duo, dyad is our fun fancy term, uh, is for that parent and that child, or the co-parents and that child, or the co-parents and those children, or whatever, to sit down and explore things for themselves, communicate one with another, and understand each other so that you can come up with ideas and try things and say things and see how it goes and then modify. I'm sorry, so I'm not going on your prompt. I will, but I want to say this last thing first. First, not first overall, before I go on to your prompt. There's what's called operant conditioning, which just means punishments and rewards, right? So there are many concepts like this that people developed the concept and explored it and kind of labeled it and categorized it and understood it in more depth and detail scientifically, but it's something that's always happened. We're looking at something that humans do and naming it and trying to understand it better, as opposed to coming up with a concept or an idea of something. There's always been punishment and rewards, right? Operant conditioning is a behavior management technique, meaning after somebody does something, you either do something that they like, positive reinforcement, you give them something that they enjoy. Negative reinforcement, you take something away from them that they dislike so that their experience is improved. Punishment, you either do something, give them something that they don't like, or take away something that they do. And you connect it to the behavior. Because you did X, I am punishing you. Well, that makes it less likely that they're going to do X again in the future. Because you did Y, I am giving you this nice thing. That makes it more likely that they'll do Y again in the future. So it's a way of managing people's behaviors. It is not in any way, shape, or form a way of managing people's internal, subjective, lived experiences. You can get anybody to do anything given the right context. That doesn't mean you can get people to like something or dislike something or be quote unquote motivated to do a thing in some internal way. You cannot create internal motivation. You can give a person a reason to do a thing, which is a motivation. I am motivating you to do a thing by threatening punishment or promising reward. But you can't make them want to do the thing. You can just make them want to get the reward or avoid the punishment and therefore be willing to do the thing. I don't know if that's like a subtle distinction for people generally, but I want to put that out there. That is treated as, in our culture, at least in large parts of our culture, operant conditioning is treated as the basis of parenting, and it does not have to be. It's not a radical idea to suggest that you don't have to punish your children, even though it sounds like a radical idea, because it's what we've all known for the most part for a long time. But that's not how it always is and or was. It is not necessary. Something that comes along with that way of parenting, for example, if I am exerting control over somebody's behavior without regard for what they want or enjoy or dislike or whatever, then intrinsically that person is going to test the limits of my ability to exert that control. And as they change, as they grow, as they develop and become more knowledgeable, more competent, more powerful, more well-spoken, sooner or later will come a point where they can break the bounds of that control. What that means is, if that's how you raise your kids, if you utilize operant conditioning, particularly punishment, but just generally behavior management in that way, then yes, as teenagers especially, most commonly, they're going to be doing everything that they can to circumvent the bounds of your ability to do that. Because that's just what happens when you control somebody. They seek to stop the control. If they liked the things that you were making them do with that control, then you're not controlling them because it's not necessary to control them. They would be doing it on their own. So parents will say, I know all teenagers hate their parents. No, they do not. There is nothing biological or inherent in a teenager in the way that humans develop that make them hate their parents. And of course, I don't think generally when people are saying that, they mean that teenagers actually hate their parents, but they mean that they're rebellious or rude or don't listen, or some version of they're trying to break free of my ability to control their behavior. That's pretty inevitable if you try to control somebody. So it's an example of some of the things that are so common in the way that we approach this, that they're just treated as default, that is the way that it is. My wife, when she was a teenager in high school, used to wake up extra early in the morning to make coffee for her mom before she went off to work. It doesn't have to happen in any particular kind of way. There are trends, right? But then we look at the trends and see what things we can do to shift it. So largely, neurodiversity-affirming parenting is going to, as much as possible, avoid utilizing operant conditioning techniques. I want to stipulate that at the beginning too, so that it doesn't later on, that there aren't expectations of like, okay, right, but how do we punish or reward these guys because they're different, right? My child is autistic and therefore I need to condition them differently. That stuff leads to, for example, ABA, which I have been very clear on my stance is abusive, not just ineffective, but abusive. It is about controlling a person's behavior with no regard for their internal experience. What the research shows us on this stuff, even if you don't agree with the reasoning behind what I'm saying, the evidence supports what we're talking about right here. That if you get people to behave in a particular way, especially by using operant conditioning techniques, then the moment you stop using those techniques, their behavior stops being what you made it be. In other words, you can get kids to do things by punishing them. And at a certain point, you will no longer be able to punish them. And therefore, they will go back to doing whatever they would have otherwise been doing. You don't create long-term lasting change that way. You're just shifting the context to make it more costly to do something that you don't want them to do, or less costly or more valuable to do something that you want them to do, right? It does not work long-term, and it does create resentment. It can't be avoided completely. I'll be clear about that, or at least I don't think it can be. The example there would be yelling at a child is not inherently meaningful other than to say, I don't like what you are doing right now and you need to stop. Well, if my kid is about to run into the street, I'm going to yell to get them to stop because it's important and it's worth doing, even though I don't normally yell. But something I have to accept as part of that is if I yell or do anything that is punishment, any inherently unenjoyable thing that is originating in me and not in the activity or the material reality of what they're dealing with itself, it's coming from me, they will like me less, trust me less, fear me more. And that's okay. We can repair those things. It doesn't mean never, ever do it or it ruins your relationship. It just means, as a rule, with no exceptions, that when a person punishes another person, the person who was punished has a more negative opinion of the person who did the punishing afterwards than they did before. And as a quick aside, that is still true when it's you punishing yourself, just to be clear. Anyway, setting a lot of parameters here, but now getting to identifying executive functioning offloading. So as a parent, in these webinars, we're going to talk about, and we're still, finalizing details and things, working on it, so it could shift. But at the moment, we're breaking it down into the first week is talking about neurodiversity, what that means and what to do about it, how to incorporate that into your parenting style. Second week, we're talking about executive functioning and what that means and what to do about it and incorporate it, blah, blah, blah. Third week, we're going to talk about specifically the accomplishment equation, which is something I've presented here before, the costs and value, looking at how to modify behavior without it being operant conditioning, because you can do that. You can get people, help people, cause people to do the things that you want them to do or avoid doing the things that you don't want them to do without using operant conditioning, which I know sounds ridiculous. That's what we know. And then we'll talk about resources, we'll talk about communication and socializing, and we'll talk about internal subjective experiences at the last of it, to try and give some way to approach that. So Zoe's prompt is to talk about that second week and the executive functioning. So one of the things that we're talking about doing is, excuse me, I need to drink some water. so much better when I have a second person with me, so I don't just have to feel awkward about being silent for a second to drink water. Most of what people talk about as executive functioning these days, usually when that term is used, people are talking about two different things. One is executive dysfunction, the other is offloading. So executive dysfunction is when you intend to do a thing, but then your behavior does not match your intention. And that can be, yes, things like, I'm going to work on this thing right now, and then I can't get myself started. That's executive dysfunction. The can't get myself started is a theory about what's happening, but the intention is to start. The behavior is not starting. That's executive dysfunction. Whenever your behavior does not match your intention, that's executive dysfunction. Executive functioning is a way of talking about the things that happen in the brain that take intention and translate it into action so that it matches. So whenever that doesn't work, which can include, procrastinating, and it can include tripping. I didn't intend to trip. I intended to walk down the hall, and I failed in that intention. That's an executive dysfunction issue, or an example of executive dysfunction. So that's one. The other is offloading. When people are talking about things like calendars and schedules and alarms and whatever, different organizational systems, all of which are great and wonderful and helpful. And we do a lot of helping people, especially in executive functioning coaching, develop those things in ways that work for them as individuals. It is not executive functioning. It's offloading, which means it is something that you are doing outside of your head, whether it's a system that you're engaging in or, help that you're getting from other people or a way of setting things up. It's stuff that's happening outside of your brain to reduce the cognitive load on the executive functioning processes in your brain. So a very easy example of that is to remember something is something that requires executive functioning skills to be engaged. You have to expend cognitive effort to remember something. But if you write something down, now you no longer need to remember it. You just need to remember where you wrote it down, which is something that at the worst still takes fewer cognitive resources than remembering the thing itself. But if you get it set up to be a system that is habitual, that you use over and over and over the same way all the time, eventually you don't even have to remember that anymore. Just think about typing, right? When you first learn to type, if you ever learned to type, home row or touch typing, whatever, you have to think about it a lot, and it's slow and it's effortful, but you do it enough and it gets to a point where you don't need to think about it anymore. So that's a big part of the advantage of using offloading systems, is that you can get to a point where those things are automatic, which is very difficult to do with any particular behavior because behavior shifts. Systems and frameworks, they can apply to many, many, many different things. If I have a calendar, anything that I have to think about doing, I can put into that calendar. Anytime I want to know what's coming up, I can look at that calendar. So it becomes a habit very easily. Whereas if I'm trying to do it without that, it's not about remembering the things I've got scheduled later. It's remembering this particular thing I have to do and remembering this other particular thing I have to do, so it doesn't become automated. Check the calendar can be automated. Another version of this, by the way, that I just find to be hilarious and, very frustrating sometimes, at least for me, is notice, for example, if you open up your phone, you probably by default go to a particular app first. There have probably been times when you have opened up your phone with the specific intention of, I gotta Google this thing, or I gotta find where this thing's located or call this person. But you open your phone and then just by habit, when you're not expending enough focus and effort there, you open Twitter or TikTok or Instagram and start scrolling it. And sometimes you're like, wait, no, that's not what I'm doing. Sometimes it's an hour later that you remember that wasn't what you're intending to do. Another version of that is you open up a browser and you go to that same website first every time. And then when there's nothing there to do, you go to that same second website every time, and blah, blah, blah. So here's what one of the things we're talking about that would be helpful. And I'll suggest to those of you here listening to this that this might be helpful for you to do as well, is to take a sheet of paper, break it into 3 sections, 3 columns, one of which is executive functioning, one is executive dysfunction, and one is offloading. This is a way to be able to distinguish those things. And I want to be clear, it's not about that this is the correct or incorrect definition of those terms, because terms mean what people use them to mean. Language is a living thing. We don't enforce meaning onto people, right? You can try, it doesn't matter. People are still going to talk the way that they talk. But it is useful to be able to separate something that you've conflated all into one thing into separate categories. For example, this has come up with clients in the past. Some people will say, I need more structure, but I hate structure. And it feels like I'm stuck. And therefore, the only answer must be that something's wrong with me. I'm messed up somehow, because how could I know that I need and want structure and do well with it, but also hate it and resent it and not want it? You're talking about multiple things, because structure is a concept. It's a label that you can apply to specific things. What you mean is that some of those specific things that you have identified as structure have been very helpful and beneficial for you, and some of those specific things that you have identified as structure you resent and hate. But if you loop it all or group it all up into just structure, then it's I love it, but I hate it. So what am I supposed to do? So we want to separate it out into different categories. The point of separating these things out into these 3 different categories is not to say, I'm going to give you a test later and I want you to be able to accurately identify what is offloading and what is executive dysfunction. It's just for you to be able to you can put whatever terms you want to put at the top of these columns. I want you to be able to distinguish between when my actions are in alignment with my intention, when what I'm doing is what I intended to do, which is something that people generally don't pay attention to. When is it that something I am intending to do, I don't end up doing, or whatever I do doesn't work out, doesn't have the effect that I was intending to have? And what are the things that I do or utilize or create or rely on external to me to make it easier for me to make it so that my actions do line up with my intentions? So executive functioning, executive dysfunctioning, and offloading. And you can start, if you like, by just trying to fill out as much as you can of examples that you remember. Keep it as recent as possible, right? That especially on the executive functioning side, I don't want you to look for like big past examples of, oh, here was a time I thought of a very tricky and difficult thing and managed it, which is great. But the whole point of this is that I want you to recognize that at every moment, your body is actually doing all kinds of stuff exactly as you want it to be doing. So try and keep it as close to the present moment as possible and go backwards on what did I consciously, not everything that your body is doing, just when you consciously intend to do a thing and then you do it, or whatever you do results in an outcome that is in line with what you were hoping to do, right? So I don't want you to put, well, my heart is beating, because that's not executive functioning. That's just autonomic. Your body is doing that with your brain is part of your body, your brain and your body. It's doing that without any conscious input. So only things that you consciously consider. Then if it works out the way you think of it, like I'm going to take a sip of this water and it worked. Good job, executive functioning. Second column is the opposite, executive dysfunction. When, again, starting in the present moment and moving backwards, trying to keep as close to the present moment as possible. What are times that you have an intention and then whatever it was that you ended up doing did not align with that intention? And I want to be clear, most people are going to focus on what we call initiation there. I don't like to call it initiation, but most people call it initiation, meaning I intend to do a thing, but I don't do the thing. I intend to start on something and I don't start. That is a particular version of this, and that's great. Put that in there. But tripping is executive dysfunction. I intended to walk to the corner without issue. Just to be clear, you probably didn't have a conscious intention to walk to the corner, but sometimes you have a conscious intention to do it and it doesn't work out. I have a conscious intention to play the song I'm learning on piano and hit the keys that I am meant to hit in the order and at the pace at which I'm trying to hit them, and I messed it up. That's executive dysfunction. And then third, look at the things in your life, again, starting in the present moment and working backwards, but staying as recent as possible. What are things outside of you, things that exist in the world, in the physical environment, that make it easier for you to be able to do the things that you intend to do? And that can include other people. It probably does. And it's important to recognize that a lot of your offloading is relying on, in fact, there's a concept that people call transactional memory, which refers to the idea that you store some of your memories in other people and they store some of their memories in you. And I know that sounds like very, I don't know, computer, like transferring data. It just means like you might not know everybody's birthday and your spouse does. They remind you when it's people's birthdays, whereas you're keeping track of, I don't know, significant holidays. I'm just trying to come up with a random example here. And they often forget that, oh, Labor Day is coming up, but you remind them. Passwords. I mean, a lot of, especially like close, either married or co-parenting couples or cohabitating people, will have situations where one of them knows the passwords more than the other, or I know the passwords for these things, you know the passwords for those things, and we reference each other. It's transactional memory. So if you are a parent, your children, probably their greatest offloading resource, the thing that they rely on the most to be able to follow through on, is you. Usually in our culture, more often than not, it's much more mom than it is dad in heterosexual couples, which I am not making a comment on whether that's good or bad or okay or fair, just that it is often the case. In fact, very frequently, mom tends to be the executive functioning center for the entire family, that it will fall on the woman in the family to be tracking everybody's schedule, making sure that everybody is aware of what things they need to be doing and coming up on and following up. And it is often not actually any easier, originally at least, because as you do a thing, you get better at it. But at the beginning, it is often not any easier for mom to be doing that stuff than it is for dad. It's just that for various cultural reasons and social reasons, it tends to be assumed that mom will handle it. I don't want to go too far down that path right now. Maybe if there were people here to talk to and ask questions and whatever. So yeah, people go on that offloading. Any organizational systems go on that offloading. Things like I always put my keys in the same spot. So that key rack is part of my offloading, as well as the concept, the idea that I put my keys there. There are people at work, if you work outside of the home, that you probably rely on for some offloading, as well as structures and systems that are in place at your place of work that you rely on, even if you're working from home, not physically at work, but within the context of work. So that's one way to start it, is to start with the present moment and work backwards. The other way, which I think is even more effective but harder to do, is to keep that thing with you. And as you go throughout your day, try to check in on, oh, there was some executive function, let me add it to the list. There was some executive dysfunction, let me add it to the list. Oh, here's something that's offloading, let me add that to the list. Did I answer your prompt, Zoe? I don't know if you're still here, but if so, give me another prompt. Otherwise, I'm going to just keep talking about, I don't know, what comes next. I'm trying to keep that as one specific assignment about identifying executive functioning offloading. Here's another one that could be helpful, is not everything is an executive functioning issue. I want to be clear that the stuff we're talking about is often very, like, executive functioning is very highly involved in that, but sometimes people just want different things. So executive functioning has, I'm not going to say nothing to, no, I am going to say nothing to do, even though that's not technically true. It's close enough to being true. Executive functioning has nothing to do with what your intentions are. It just is about whether or not those intentions are enacted in a way that works. So it's important to identify differences between when somebody wants something differently than somebody else versus when they want something and executive functioning is getting in the way. In other words, if I am telling somebody to take out the trash and they don't want to take out the trash and therefore don't take out the trash, that's not an executive functioning issue. It's only if they want to take out the trash and fail to take out the trash that it's an executive functioning issue. So in interpersonal communication, but especially in parent-child dynamics, because that's what we're focused on right now. If you are trying to get somebody to do something or not do something or whatever, and they are not going in the direction that you're wanting them to go, it's important to identify which thing we're talking about here. And later on, we'll break that down even more specifically with cost and value, because that's a more useful way, I think, to look at it. It's not really this binary, because if you tell them to take out the trash and they hear that, they want to take out the trash if for no other reason than because they don't want you to be upset or they want you to be happy or whatever. But it's not a binary thing. We're treating it as binary for right now. Later on, we'll get more into the nuance. So really, we just mean, is it more an issue of they don't want to do the thing, or more an issue of they want to do the thing but are for some reason struggling or have been unable to do the thing? Biggest way to look at that at the beginning is the amount of distress it causes you. If doing something that you do or failing to do something that you're trying to do causes you a lot of distress, the fact that you do it or don't do it, that's an executive functioning issue. So people all the time will say, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just don't want to get it done. I guess I'm not motivated to do it. I wish I was. Or a phrase I'll hear a lot is, I want to do it. And of course, those things, what does that mean? That you want to do it. You just mean, I want to do it. I wish I were actually doing it. And I think that the reason that I'm not must be because I don't want it. But if you don't want it, it wouldn't bother you that you're not doing it. Especially for academics, really. I mean, if nothing else, if I can get this one thing across more than anything else, this might be the thing I would pick out of this whole thing. Especially in academics, if the way that somebody is engaging with academics, if the way that they're doing or not doing their homework or preparing or not preparing for tests or whatever is causing them emotional distress, it is not an issue of motivation. It's not an issue of intention or desire or how much they value it. It is an issue of executive functioning. If it bothers you, that means you want it. The more it bothers you, the more you want it. Period. Now, why you might want it can be broken down into a lot of different things. Maybe you don't care so much about the grade, but you do care about how your parents think of you, or the punishment that you might, or how the other kids or the teacher perceive you. Even though you don't care about getting an A in and of itself, you want them to know that you're somebody who gets an A. Whatever. We can talk about the elements of why somebody might want a thing, but hard and fast rule, if you are feeling distress about your own behavior, it's not an issue of that you don't want your behavior to be different enough. And again, I'm oversimplifying here. We'll get more into the nuance later. So that can be helpful. And in fact, I can prompt Zoe, let's do that. We can write down some prompts of like conversation starters to help people explore and develop language around desire and impulse and want and motivation, all these things, because those words tend to cause problems. Like, again, I want it. It's something that obviously means something to the person who's saying it, even though the words themselves don't seem to make sense. But that causes problems in communication. If I say I want it, that means something to me, but because it's not super clear exactly what I mean by that in terms of what those words generally are used to mean, you're going to have a hard time understanding it to mean exactly what I understand it to mean. It's much more likely that your interpretation of what I'm saying will be different than mine, because I'm using words in a way that they are not usually used. So that causes issues, and we want to be able to clarify things. And again, this goes more into the cost and value. There's reasons that we have that language later on. But some that I find helpful, just to put this out there for people. Want is a term that, like executive function, tends to get a lot of different things put underneath it. So I like to separate those things out. You've noticed me use the word intend a lot. A lot of times when people say want, they want to do something. That means I have an idea. I have decided that I will do a thing when it is time to do that thing, right? That is intention. Intention is, I have a specific idea. It doesn't have to be like granular. I could have the intention to have a good day, but it is a specific idea of something that I want to do, some behavior or some outcome that will result from my behavior that I'm trying to go after. I would call that intention. Sometimes when people say want, they mean a visceral, like moment to moment, we'll call it phenomenological experience of a sense of, well, some people call it motivation, drive, whatever, desire, want for a thing. Meaning in a given moment, for whatever reason, my brain has constructed, we call this volition. It's one of the building blocks of cognition. You can't really break it down any further than this, that when I say I want that thing, or that thing seems enjoyable or preferable to me, or I am going to try to get that thing, that you can't break it down further than that in a momentary way. So I call that impulse. That, if I open the fridge and look and there are 4 different drinks that I could drink, I don't know why I stumbled over that word. If I open the fridge and there's 4 different drinks, 4 different drink options in there, then I likely am not going to think very deeply through, like, okay, let me weigh the pros and cons here, whatever. Just some information based on my state at the point and whatever is going to result in an impulse of, I feel like having that right now. It's not like an intellectually reasoned through thing that I can explain or need to justify. It's just an impulse. And sometimes we don't want to follow through on impulses, even though there's an idea that, oh, that seems good. There's a reason not to do it. So that's another way of talking about want. Hope is one that I find useful. Sometimes when people say want, what they mean is, here's something long-term, something far into the future, relatively, depends on what scale you're talking about, that I think I would like. And I like to talk about that as hope. I hope to have this thing. Sometimes hope gets conflated with other things, and so I'll use the term desire for that, or plan, if people like to go that direction. But here's what we're talking about here is long-term things where it's like, I want to be an actor when I grow up, for example. What you mean is, based on all the information I have about myself and the world and what options there are and what an actor is and whatever, I'm guessing that when I am an adult, that's going to be the thing that will be the best fit for me, bring me the most joy, etc. Will that actually be the case? We don't know, especially the further into the future you're projecting, right? Like in kindergarten, pretty much every kid wants to either be a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, an athlete, some version of something famous, actor, performer, artist, whatever, or something that one of their parents or an adult that they're close with is, because they just don't know that many things. And generally adults, when we hear that from kindergartners, don't think, okay, well then we better start working very diligently toward you becoming that thing when you're an adult, because we know that's very far into the future. And while you still may want to do that later, my wife, for example, wanted to be a teacher her whole life and became a teacher. You very well may not. The further into the future we're projecting, the more we have to acknowledge that things change and we don't know what's going to happen at the time. It just means in this moment, I think that's what I would like to experience later on. Until and unless things change or I become aware of new information, right? So plan can be that, but I like to call it hope. I don't know. I just have fun with that. So different ways to break things down like that. Because otherwise, as an example, I don't want to go to that party tonight. Do I mean that I have no desire, I lack a desire to go to the party, but also have no objection to going to that party? And therefore, if you want me to, it won't be very hard to get me to, because I'm not trying to avoid it. I don't want to go. Or do I mean, no, I want to avoid going to that party and would be willing to pay a cost in order to avoid going to that party? Either way, I'm saying I don't want to go to that party. But it's 2 very different things, and 2 different things that should be responded to in 2 very different ways. But usually what happens is somebody says, I don't want to go to that party tonight. The other person interprets that to mean one of those 2 things and responds as though it is the one that they think that it is, which it might be, but it might not. And if it's not, here's where we start getting into problems, right? I was going to say more, but I'm going to stop there because it's 2 o'clock and I should wrap up. Thank you all for being here. Fun to talk about this stuff. I'll be back same time next week, Wednesday, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. Thank you.